Welcome. Thank you for being back. If this is your first time, thank you for being here. There are other videos already, however they do it on the internet, so you can find them. It is Friday, and almost sundown, so the Sabbath is closing in. So I'm going to try and make this relatively quick, although there's few things that I can imagine doing that's more respectful of the Sabbath than what I'm about to tell you about. There will be many sessions, but several of them are put in the form of 7 things. 7 less known facts about topics. Some of the topics are known and some are not. And what I want to talk about today is one that's lesser known, and that is James. I may have to put on my glasses. What a wonderful invention. I am now of the age, and as the sun goes down, I'm going to have trouble, because I had to put these things on a list so that I would, since I'm only supposed to do 7, I have to put them on a list instead of my usual rambling, I guess. So I want to talk about James. There was a video that I did about why there are so many Marys, and so you might watch that. There's a lot of Marys now for different reasons, but at the time of my birth in life, there were a lot of us named Mary, and you can look at that video. And there were a lot of James. And in the writings in the Canon that made it into the Canon, there's 3 James that I can discern. One is the brother of John, and he sadly was killed probably 10 years or so after Jesus' crucifixion. Then there's another that is referred to often as James the Lesser, which in my language can really just mean James the Younger. And then, and he's the son of Alphaeus. And then there's James, the brother of Jesus. And there is so much evidence of him in Scripture and in history books that it astounds me that he's been overlooked, forgotten, or underappreciated. He was such a good man, he was called James the Just. He was such a holy, prayerful person, and seen as our leader, as he was, that he was once each year on Yom Kippur allowed into the Holy of Holies in the temple. Only high priests are allowed there. That's part of who James was. And if you want to look him up, again, Paul's letters are about the only ones that made it into canon. There's one wonderful one from James, and there's others, but most are written by Paul or some of his followers. So, nevertheless, and you may or may not remember that Paul really, he never met Jesus in life. So he was not one of the original followers. But he does talk about James. And he talks about James being the brother of Jesus. And he talks about James being a super apostle and one of the 3 pillars. Because for a short time, James, John, and Peter all worked together for the community to heal from the crucifixion and begin the process of moving forward as instructed by Jesus. So Paul defines him, describes him, identifies him, as does Josephus, who was a Pharisee and survived the revolt, which I'll tell you more about some other time, and wrote histories from Rome. And he talked about James and specifically said that revolt was, at least in part, a reaction to James' murder. Because as respected as he was also righteous, and he would not back down. Just as Jesus didn't. He was never violent. But just as Jesus had, he continued to call for Jubilee, which is defined in Leviticus. Jubilee is one of those things that's about the number 7, where every 7 years there are special celebrations. Every 7 years things happen, whether it's the forgiveness of debts, the return of lands, the freedom of slaves and servants, and eventually there's periods where no one is to farm, so the earth has a rest. It's a way of resetting the scales, and that is what God directs. And that has a lot to do with why James was put to death, because the people were starving. And yet Rome and the Sanhedrin, which was the governing body of Hebrews, who were largely in league with Rome, not all, but many, refused to honor Jubilee. So I've heard the saying about the rich get rich and the poor get poor. Well, that was happening. And James was killed in what you call 62 of the Common Era. And the revolt started 4 years later. He was so pious that his clothes were often dusty from kneeling, and supposedly his knees had calluses as big as would be on a camel's. And for being such a righteous man, he was also so kind, tender, and gentle. I certainly recommend that you read his letter, the only one that made it into the canon, not the only one. He, like Jesus and like many, knew how to read and write. Certainly Scripture. They both preached from Scripture. And in another video, I'll talk more about that. But the Essenes, who are known for the Dead Sea Scrolls now, and a place called the Qumran, they had pockets all over of their own people in each community. And those people taught the children of those communities to read. The boys got more education than the girls, but girls were educated too. And yes, I can read. All right, I'm sure that I've covered 7 things about James, but I recommend you read his letter, and if you read it next to Galatians from Paul, you will see that they are either talking to each other or about each other. And as Paul argues that faith is all that matters, James says, you show me your faith without works, I will show you mine by my works. The teachings matter. Go in peace. Love God and each other. Thank you for being here. Feel free to put your comments below and any requests that you have for other topics. There's so much to say.